What's going on? This is the Saturday Down South podcast presented to you by Texas Pete. I am Connor O'Gara. Will, you're rocking a lacrosse jersey today. How are we doing?
Yeah, man. I'm doing fantastic, man. It's a little bit early morning for us. I had my day get shifted down, so Connor's been working with me, but this is a rare instance of the non-Sunday early morning episode of us recording. So doing good, man. Had my protein coffee, you know what I'm saying? Feeling good.
I have not found a protein coffee that I like yet. Maybe one day it'll happen, but for me, those are separate deals. Separate deals can't combine. Can be consumed in the same sitting, but not within the same glass for me just yet. You have all but guaranteed that we are going to get cold taked by something. We're recording this at 10 o'clock Monday morning, and this will be out probably by the time people are listening to this, like close to 24 hours from now. That's just the way that the schedule sets up today. So we have all but guaranteed that there will be massive college football news late in the day on Monday. I'm trying to speculate what that could be. Sharon Moore was already named Michigan coach, so it can't be that. We've already had the Nick Saban retirement, so it can't be that. Let's think big. How about Kirby steps down and decides to become a travel baseball dad? Can that happen Monday afternoon?
You know what's great about that is I actually do see Kirby just one day retiring at 60 early and just being like, you know what, I'm done. It's just getting in like a minivan and just driving off, be like, I'm gonna go be with my family.
Yeah, it would still be another decade in college football. Look, if he wins 5 titles, and by the time that it's all said and done, Georgia fans would look up and be like, yeah, this was incredible. This was everything we hoped it could be and more. I mean, let's not dig into the how many years does Kirby have left conversation just yet. Let's wait until he turns 50, but let's speculate wildly of what's going to happen on this Monday afternoon. We have a great show lined up. Great show. Adam Sparks is going to join us to talk about kind of Tennessee's path in 2024 to SEC relevance, bounce back season, a lot of Nico talk, different things to dig into, and what's an interesting year for Josh Heupel that awaits. And then we're going to end with Jersey Contest and Lad of the Week. But first, there is an atypical path for the SEC's 5-star quarterbacks in year two. Year two. We're not talking year one, like where you show up on campus and everybody's singing your praises and everything that you do goes viral. And it's like, oh my God, this guy is going to be a Heisman winner one day. It's, I call that the honeymoon phase of 5-star quarterbacks. Year two is kind of like, all right, what are we getting? What's this going to turn into? It has been over a decade since we have seen what I would call a typical year two progression for a 5-star quarterback in the SEC, and I can prove it. 5-star quarterbacks are just based on the where they're ranked in the 247 Sports composite when they signed. We're not talking about, I'm not going to pick and choose and be like, well, this quarterback was a 5-star quarterback on this site, or this guy was a 5-star quarterback, but he got hurt and then he ended up signing as a 4-star. Like, no. We're just talking about when these guys signed, because that's the data point that we look back and we point to. It's just about if you're a 5-star quarterback in the 247 Sports composite when you signed, that's it. So I'm going to read the year that these guys signed, and obviously the following year was year two for them. So this is 5-star quarterbacks coming into the SEC as recruits, and we're going back to 2011. Okay, I picked this as a starting point for a very specific reason. That guy was. Sorry, go ahead.
I love when you hit me with a topic like this that I have no I've never thought of year two 5-star quarterbacks, so I can't wait to see who's on this list. I love going against something like blind like this. This is awesome.
Buckle in. It's a wild ride. A truly wild ride. And it was one that before I kind of dug into it on Saturday afternoon as Claire was taking a nap, I was thinking to myself, I know it's pretty wild based on the names that I'm thinking of, but specific to year two, it is all over the place. And we will learn there is no such thing as typical for these 5-star quarterbacks in the SEC. Jeff Driscoll.
Speaking of that, I'm glad that you started with Driscoll and not Russell Shepard, who just never threw a pass.
Russell Shepard. Could have started with Russell Shepard, also in the same class as a certain Aaron Murray, which would have been, kind of an interesting guy to compare to as well, because Aaron did have what I would call a typical year two back in 2010. 2010, where he beats out Mettenberger, something they just talked about on this very show, and how it was like, okay, you see some good things out of him, but it was still going to be a down year for Georgia. I think that's what we come to expect for some of these guys in year two within what we would consider the typical year two progression. So Jeff Driscoll at Florida, 2012, he gets a chance to start because the 5-star ahead of him, John Brantley, he's out of eligibility. It was supposed to go Tebow to Brantley to Driscoll, and Florida would just become essentially like what Oklahoma became with the quarterback pipeline, what Alabama became with the quarterback pipeline more recently. Maybe it was Tebow to Cam to Driscoll, whatever. It was supposed to be great quarterbacks, one after another. They're all lined up. The expectation was that Driscoll would be part of this pipeline, and then between kind of this lost year of Urban and then just Brantley, never really figuring it out, never really becoming the guy that Florida hoped he would be, it turned into whether or not Driscoll could resurrect this Florida offense. And as you know, there is no such thing as resurrecting an offense when Will Muschamp is your head coach.
Correct. I fully agree so far, 100%.
The best offense that Will Muschamp ever had, I went back and looked this up because I'm like, this is going to depress me, but I need to just know this. Best off, he never had a top 50 offense ever in his time as a head coach. And that includes South Carolina.
It's got to be like a scary movie where like he's furious at you for not having a good offense, but he also won't let you run your offense. So every week he just slams the door open and he's like, why did we score more than 20 points this week? It's like, Will, I keep trying to change the nomenclature here. You won't let me.
It's unbelievable. I mean, like to have the quarterback talent that Muschamp had and to never get to that place is frustrating. So obviously that's a part of the Driscoll conversation, even though we know Muschamp isn't the one operating that offense. But the good news for Driscoll was that Florida's defense in 2012 was really, really good, and it fueled that 11-win season, even though the offense was incredibly bad. Like, so bad that it had 0 games with 220 passing yards on the season. And after September, Florida never threw for 200 yards in a game. That is hard to do. That includes the Louisiana game where Florida needed the game-winning punt return. Everybody knows how that went. That was all part of that weird, all over the place year 2 for Driscoll, where if you were on the positive side, you were saying, well, look at his surrounding pieces, guys winning football games. That's kind of all you can hope for. And obviously it wasn't just passing. He had his legs, but we know what happened after that. Okay. His career never turned into what many hoped it would because he got hurt. And then when he was back, he wasn't necessarily given the keys to be able to run and operate the offense in the way that you would expect a guy of his caliber of recruit to be given that opportunity. And it never really worked out. He transfers to Louisiana Tech, whatever. Not a typical year 2 progression. 2014, Kyle Allen at Texas A&M.
Wait, hold on. I do want to say something about Driscoll that's very funny. So other than Josh Dobbs, I think he is probably the funniest guy that has just turned up in the NFL to me because he is actively just still in the NFL. He has been in the NFL for almost 10 years. One of the strangest guys ever because the recruiting services, it appears, we're right about him. He's an NFL quarterback. Like, he's a backup. He's a spot starter. But how many people in the world are NFL quarterbacks? Like, that's one of the funniest guys ever when you look at his progression, because it's like, you're right. His college career never turned into what we thought it would, but we can't really call him a fraud at all. He just had bad coaching. And furthermore, if he had better coaching, who knows what he would be doing in the NFL? Because with the worst offensive coach we could think of, put up other than like Les Miles, maybe, he's still, I mean, it's not like he's been with great, smart organizations in the NFL. This is kind of a list of losers that he's been with, pre-Bengals, pre-Burrow Bengals, Lions, pre-right now, Texans, pre-right now. So it's like, it's not like he was given great opportunities at any stage. So this dude is actually just a story of perseverance.
And he's similar to Kyle Allen, who was still in the NFL and was, yes, Kyle Allen is still in the NFL.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Wow.
Go look that one up as well. Seriously. Kyle Allen is still getting NFL paychecks. And it was wild to think about kind of why his career fell off and what it turned into, because it was similar to Driscoll in that you're hoping that he could be like, the legend who had moved on a couple years earlier. With Driscoll, it was Tebow. With Allen, it was Manziel. And he played a significant role as a true freshman after the Kenny Trill era kind of came and went year 2. And he beats out freshman Kyler Murray to be able to have that job to himself in year 2. But Murray is the next one that we're going to talk about. And those two obviously are very, synonymous with their time at A&M and kind of the Sumlin era as a whole. Because in 2015, Murray is at A&M as a true freshman, and he ends up, of course, transferring before year 2, where Kevin Sumlin somehow does the unthinkable of losing 2 5-star quarterbacks off of his roster in a month's time. It's a pretty tough thing to be able to do. And Kevin Sumlin, got to give that man credit. When it came to replacing Manziel, it was a masterclass of failure that they struggled with. How much of that was because of the Cliff Kingsbury departure? I would say that was significant because that was back in the day when Cliff Kingsbury was a major, major asset and somebody that was very coveted and was one of the top offensive minds in the sport. But we know during that 2015 season, Allen got hurt. So Murray then comes in. He starts 3 games as a true freshman, and then Allen comes back in to finish the year. But Allen bolts at season's end, which should have, in theory, said to Kyler Murray, the offense is yours, man. This is what you wanted. But he did not like the direction of the offense. There was disagreement with the way that they were being used and what the coordinator situation was and the quarterback's coach. And there was just not alignment in ways that you would think there should be for having a quarterback room that talented. So he then obviously opts to transfer to Oklahoma. Smart move by both guys. Ended up working out really well, I would say, for both guys. And they were probably better off not necessarily sticking around. And they sensed, this isn't going in the way that it should. Let's find a place where it will. And they did not have the typical year 2 progression, or at least what we would assume is a typical year 2 progression for a 5-star quarterback.
Yes, and to your point, this is made even more impressive by the fact that this was far before the portal era. I mean, losing 2 5-star quarterbacks right now, just for context, everyone's, the sky is falling in Alabama. They've lost a quarterback. You know what I'm saying? And these dudes found a way to lose 2 quarterbacks and had to go talk to the NCAA about it. Had to go Mr. Whatever goes to Washington and be like, we would like release of our contract. And they were so out on Texas A&M.
It's not something that's going to make the top of your resume. Let's just say that it will be seen as your undoing if you have that happen, especially when you should be set up for success for years. And that's what I think Kirby deserves at least some credit for. It was, as much as we want to talk about losing, the coveted transfers, the 5-star guys, he actually kept them on campus with the exception of Fields, and then Easton's a little bit of a different situation. But Vandegrift staying there as long as he did. Vandegrift stayed there for 3 years. We were talking about that even before we came on. Oh yeah, Brock Vandegrift is not entering year 2 of college. He was at Georgia for 3 years, and now he is moving on to Kentucky. Okay, so 2015, Blake Barnett at Alabama. Yeah. 2016 Bama season opener against USC was one of the most disrespectful things ever. Blatantly disrespectful on all fronts, because Bama is out here having a quarterback battle against a ranked team, and USC was acting like it was just waiting to be released. The old chomping at the bit pregame clip that will live in infamy ever. I mean, one of the all-time pregame, we should not have done this. We poked the bear in the worst possible ways. You don't want Bama, trust me. And we know what played out with the Bama quarterback situation and how that was kind of the launching of Jalen Hurts' career. After Blake Barnett gets those first snaps, it goes punt, 3 and out, and then Jalen Hurts is able to step in. 2 drives was all Blake Barnett got, and then Jalen got 3. That's the difference. He got 3, and then we know what happens the rest of that game. Blake Barnett transfers 4 weeks into the season, and man, he got roasted. He got roasted. I went back and watched some of those clips of the takeaways, and people are just like, this guy's not a team player. And I get it. It's not a good precedent to set to just transfer mid-season, but after the way that things played out, clearly he was frustrated, and this was anything but a typical year 2 progression for a 5-star quarterback.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever rooted for Bama as hard as I did that day when I saw USC's walk out when they were pretending to be cage dogs. And then, as you said, I mean, it was really just a quarterback competition because Alabama could have fielded no quarterback and still beaten USC because their defense was so electric that day. They literally could have just fielded 10 people and ran the ball and kicked field goals and beat USC. And the fact that they were actively just kind of having tryouts on the field while USC was just getting bludgeoned. And my favorite fact about this game that I often bring up is that Hurts fumbled on his first snap, and Kiffin was still just you know what? I know talent. I'm going with that guy. And hey, he was right because Barnett is chilling right now. He is not playing football for sure.
Arizona State, then USF, and don't remember what his best season was. But Bama was probably right. I mean, Bama was right to turn to Jalen Hurts. I think we can all say that with certainty in the way that it played out when he's SEC Offensive Player of the Year as a true freshman, and obviously is a Deshaun Watson pick play from winning a national championship. Alleged pick play. At least that's what I've been told.
Allegedly, yeah, that's what we gotta call it. Yeah, I mean, I'm just sad that I didn't have the forethought to call this year's Alabama USF matchup the Blake Barnett Bowl. I feel like I failed you. So
we failed the listeners of this show for not calling it the Blake Barnett Bowl. Who could ever possibly forget that? 2016, very interesting year for SEC five-star quarterbacks, of course, because Shea Patterson at Ole Miss ahead of year two. His year two is supposed to be 2017. All right, you got a lot of reps in that offense. Year one, you feel like you should be taking that next step, and then boom, the Hugh Freeze escort service scandal happens, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing typical about having your offensive-minded play-calling head coach fired in late July ahead of your year two. And even though I would argue, I think Shea Patterson kind of made the best of it and flashed some promise in year two. I said a lot of very positive things about him before he transferred to Michigan, but there crept that doubt. That doubt was sort of clouding that season just about the program as a whole, obviously, because of the NCAA punishments that were on the way. And was Shea Patterson going to stay at Ole Miss knowing that was going to happen? I would argue that was not a typical year two progression at all. And that was a very unique situation that ultimately led to him transferring to Michigan.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, this is the other side of kind of some of the stuff we talk about with Michigan or Alabama, where it's like, this dude had, I don't know, but you would think he had nothing to do with what went on at Ole Miss and everything. And so the fact that he was just kind of stranded out there after his coach got busted breaking the rules, like that's supposed to be your mentor leadership figure. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, that was kind of unfair to him that he got stuck in this situation just because he signed a line not knowing what he signed up for.
I would have loved to have seen Shea Patterson with the big bad versions of DK Metcalf and AJ Brown, because while I'm a Jordan Ta'amu respecter, I am big time. OG listeners of this show know that we respect Jordan Ta'amu, we really do. But Shea could do some things, man. Like Shea could really sling the pill. Like when he was at his best, he was fun, and everybody was making. The problem was with him is that people are making the Manziel comparisons when they shouldn't. We should just abstain from all Manziel comparisons at all times. But man, when he was at his best, he was a fun guy to be able to watch, and didn't really feel like he went to a place where his abilities were going to be maximized with what Michigan was trying to do. That's a different conversation though, but not a typical year two. Another very atypical year two, 2016 class, Jacob Eason at Georgia. Kirby's first big recruiting win after getting that job was keeping Jacob Eason in that class. Huge deal, big deal. We know what he did in year one. He gets to be the starter that entire season. Coming back, going into year two, I remember as I'm just starting this job on the SDS side, writing about the things that I thought he could do. I thought he had all SEC type upside. You look at the kind of the pieces around him, how it's going to shape up for year two in that offense. And then boom, we know what happens. He gets hurt early in that first game of the year. He gives way to Jake Fromm. I still think that in 2017, this might be a controversial take. And I really like Jake Fromm and defended Jake Fromm. I'm going to defend Jake Fromm another time in this episode. But I do think that Jacob Eason could have been, if he had gotten just 3 years of starting at Georgia with those surroundings, could they have gone to a national championship in 2017? Maybe not. Maybe he made too many mistakes and the offense would have been built a little bit too much around him. But goodness gracious, man. With Michelle and Chubb and freshman DeAndre Swift in that backfield with that offensive line, that team was built to be able to have a run like what they did because of obviously the defense looking like a Kirby defense, what we came to expect with Roquan leading the way. But I still think that Eason could have been a great player at Georgia. I really, really do. But obviously, if a guy like Fromm steps in and does what he does and gets Georgia to its best season since the early 80s, and he does that as a true freshman, a guy who looks exactly the same as he did when he was playing the Little League World Series, and we got reminders of that every single week that he played football.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, of course, that guy is going to be the starter. And by the end of the year, it was so inevitable that he was gone because, yeah, why would Georgia deviate from that? It was just a tough spot and not the year two that anybody could have projected for Jacob Eason.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of the hot take artists, or especially national slash NFL guys, like talking about, oh, how did Kirby not play Justin Fields, X, Y, and Z? I feel like if you saw the Jacob Eason part of this and you saw the way that Jake Fromm came up and rose to prominence, that really let you know what was going on there. Because the way that Fromm was like a hero, almost a la Stetson Bennett, early, even earlier in his career than Bennett was, and the fact that they went from this, not a good season that Eason started, where it wasn't his fault or anything, right? The team was just in turmoil because they had just changed coaches. But to kind of elevate this team to this national title, to beat Notre Dame, to do all the things that Fromm did, that's why Kirby trusted him so much until the end. So I think the Eason note is a very good note with the Fromm story, because people often only see the end of it, where he had put a ceiling on the team and done all this stuff. But as far as how he came on the scene, like you said, super young in his career was Fromm when he was leading the team. And so the thought was he had more to learn. The sky was the limit, because he had beat out this freak talent in Jacob Eason, who still in the NFL as well. Not, starting games or anything, but NFL talent.
Is he really still in the NFL? I didn't realize that.
Oh, yeah. He was the famous New York Giants rumble forward guy. Yeah.
Oh, didn't realize that. Good for Jacob Eason. Keep getting those NFL paychecks. We will get to Justin Fields in just a second here. But 2017, Tua Tagovailoa. Jake Fromm just missed out on being a 5-star, so that's why he's not included in this conversation. But Tua, 2017, this is the first guy of this group who has taken the optimistic year two progression and kind of blown it out of the water, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is an atypical year two progression. This is not typical either. There is nothing typical about a Heisman Trophy runner-up season that, for my money, should have resulted in him winning the Heisman, but everyone got obsessed with the bad SEC championship showing against an elite Georgia defense. And we pretended that Kyler followed the Heisman path and followed this linear Heisman progression, even though the only top 30 defense that he faced that year was Army, and he needed overtime to be able to win that day. Nobody likes to talk about that except for me. But Tua was not.
I'll talk about Oklahoma was losing Army any day, buddy. Let me know. We'll schedule a Zoom. Let's do it.
And if I recall, that game was on. It was like a pay-per-view game.
Oh, yeah. It was on some weird-ass, like, over-the-air channel that was almost... I feel like it was in 4x3 resolution, which is probably me making that part of it up. But it felt like it was. It felt like I was glued to a television, like Courage the Cowardly Dog, watching that happen.
And I ranked Kyler pretty low on my Heisman winners of the 14 playoff era because of that. Because, dude faced one top 30 defense up to that point and didn't look particularly good. Now, he played well in the playoff, right? He played well in the playoff against Bama, a game that Bama controlled and was up throughout. He did some really good things in the second half. But, again, we can't use revisionist history with the Heisman. That game was after the Heisman Trophy. But I was not necessarily big on Kyler winning the Heisman, as great of a player as he ultimately was. But Tua was a revelation in 2018. I mean, he was fantastic. And I think I saw him at his absolute best, and I saw him at his absolute worst. I think I saw him play 3 games that year in person, at least 3. Yeah, because I was at the opener against Louisville. I was at the Ole Miss game where DK had opening play touchdown that game. That was electric too. Shout out to Grove. That was a fun day. And then the SEC championship, obviously, where he had easily his worst game of the year. He gets hurt in the fourth quarter. Jalen Hurts comes in. We all know how that plays out. But Tua was incredible. He was incredible in 2018 as a year 2 guy. And so if you're using that to set your expectation for what is typical for a year 2 guy as a former 5-star, I would say that's way too high. That's not fair. That is an outlier of all of these. Absolutely an outlier, and one that we should probably have even more respect for, knowing how early he was in his football career, despite the fact that he was already on the national stage because of the national championship heroics and 2nd and 26 and all that.
Yeah, Tua is one of the few athletes that I remember seeing as a high schooler and feeling like fear, and then that fear coming true. His highlights were crazy. They were similar to the Army game, like feel like it was in Hawaii, right? So the videography wasn't great, and it was like you were watching this superhero because he was like mobile a little bit in high school, and it was like does this guy have a force field around him? Like, is there some kind of a conspiracy to never tackle this guy? Because it was like every play was like him throwing guys sideways, like hitting guys down. I was like, where did they unearth this guy? Like, what type of superhero is this character, Tua Tagovailoa, whose name, I couldn't pronounce when I first saw it. And watching him play, I immediately went, yeah, that's the same guy I saw in film, other than the running part of it, obviously. But I was like, ugh. And I feel like he was like you said, I mean, maybe it didn't have the happiest ending, but it was a storybook to a point. He blew right past expectations.
Tua's mobility pre-hip injury against Mississippi State was more special than it gets credit for. Like some of the things that he would do, like the play that I saw him make against Louisville, where he just gets spun every which way, and you're like, who is this alien? It was incredible. And obviously things changed for him, and he had to kind of tweak his style and the concussions and all that. But in year 2, the conversation was still, this guy, for the majority of the year, was the best player in college football. Okay, I told you we would talk about Justin Fields. Obviously, 2018, he transfers before year 2. So he does not get a year 2 at Georgia, which was still the byproduct of 2 things, not one thing. Did Kirby use Fields correctly during his true freshman season? No. I do believe that Jake Fromm should have been the starter, but should Fields have come in and thrown the ball? Yeah, absolutely. 30 of his 39 pass attempts came against 3 non-Power 5 teams in Vandy. He needed to throw the football more, and Kirby did not recognize the importance of that in the way that he later would with Carson Beck. And one of the reasons why I think Carson Beck stuck at Georgia as long as he did was because he actually got to throw the football in 2022 as Stetson Bennett's understudy. But did Fields also assume that he was going to be better than Jake Fromm and ignore the historical significance of him leading Georgia to its first title berth since the Herschel era? Yes, he ignored that. And that is on Fields. I will always say that even as a Justin Fields Bears defender, I would still argue that there were pieces of what he entered that he did not fully grasp. And so Kirby gets dogged for it because of what Fields became. Justin Fields is not system proof. He's not. I can say that. I'm allowed to say that as somebody that has watched a lot of Justin Fields with some bad offensive coordinators. And I truly don't know. As much as I think he would have been great at Georgia and the things that he could do, it was fun. But do I think that if Georgia hadn't tweaked its system significantly, that he could have had moments where you're like, I don't really know, man. I don't really know if he's going to take that next step. Yeah, I would argue that he would have been somewhat limited with the offense that Georgia wanted to run at that time, pre-Munkin era.
Yeah, I think that's something that might not happen as frequently going forward, but it was a little bit of the regionalism of college football that, he wanted to stay a little bit closer to home. He wanted to be with his family and do all that. But in reality, to your point, Georgia just was not set up to have a quarterback like that. And in fact, when Kirby won championships, it didn't look at all like Justin Fields. It was very regimented. And when Stetson made plays, outside of the framework of the offense, it wasn't like it was designed that way. I know I just said outside of the framework of the offense, but like to your point, I think they would have had to retool the whole offense. I think that now Kirby has won. We have seen what his blueprint successfully looks like, but I just thought that was a mutual bad decision. As a coach, you're always going to take a player like that, but I don't think there was ever going to be the time, there was ever going to be the malleability within Kirby to get the most out of Justin Fields. And I think that what we really spared ourselves from was a year of like a weird battle where everyone felt like Kirby was doing everything wrong, but he didn't have the skills to really have that type of an advanced hybrid offense that would maximize him. So I really don't think we missed out on much. I think he tried to do quote unquote the right thing with his peers and family and all that. And then he was like, whatever, we went to Ohio State and it worked out.
It worked out great for him at Ohio State. Like he had the 2-year career that you could have hoped for. He got Ohio State to a national championship game, and obviously they were overmatched against Bama. And I'm not saying that if he were healthy, they win that game, because that's not making up the difference of that scoring. I think he would have performed better if he didn't have the rib injury in the national championship, but they were still not winning that football game against Bama. 2019, we had Bo Nix as a true freshman that year. Hey, This is a candidate. This is a guy that could have had a typical year 2 progression, but we don't, because there is nothing typical, and I cannot emphasize this enough. There is nothing typical about having year 2 play calls from Chad Morris.
Chad Morris Gus Malzahn, that's like a horror show if you're a young developing quarterback. It's like, hey, son, you ever played tight end? You know what? I'll give it a shot just so I don't have to have any more bad tape out there.
We always talk about, Kyler not really liking the vision of the A&M offense going into his year 2. What if Bo Nix had just said, and obviously the legacy stuff and his connection to Auburn was always going to win out and going to overshadow this. But what if Bo Nix had said, oh, you hired Chad Morris as your offensive coordinator? Deuces, I'm out. Let's not deal with that. Good for Chad Morris for somehow getting another job at Texas State. TJ Finley dodging that bullet. Texas State, that's what it was, right? Yeah, Texas State, I want to say. When Chad Morris is trending, that's an automatic click for me on the app formerly known as Twitter. Automatic every single time. I would like to put an asterisk next to Bo Nix's year 2. And not just because, he took a tiny dip in quarterback rating. His rushing production was essentially the same, albeit 2 fewer games. I remember that year, someone very close to Gus told me that he was worried about Gus's future right after the Chad Morris hire. And I was like, yep, he's doomed.
Correct. He should be.
We can all see this. Gus somehow cannot see this. And boom, what happened? Bo Nix is asked to operate the Chad Morris offense. It was 90th in the country in scoring, and Auburn paid the richest buyout ever to a head coach at the time. The Chad Morris effect was alive and well in the Plains in year 2 of Bo Nix.
Yesterday, UCF made some coaching staff hires, and they moved a lot of guys around, and everybody was talking about, oh, this guy is the co-executive associate play caller or whatever. And I'm like, guys, there are 2 kinds of people on this earth. People that understand Gus Malzahn and people that do not. And if you do not, every year feels like some wild roller coaster because you think everything's going to be new. The deal is the only creative window dressing that Gus has at this point in his career is messaging. What he's actually going to do at the end of the day is going to be the exact same no matter what. Now, he's getting more creative about how he packages it. But I think that this is a pretty good example of that. And a guy that I do legitimately feel for because he was, a much more souped up version of the Justin Fields situation where, to your point, his dad was a good quarterback back in, the glory days of Auburn, and he stuck with it a little bit longer than, anyone could have expected. This was a guy who transferred that, if you blame him for transferring, you're just you don't get it because this dude really stayed past where he logically should have and hurt himself. We're seeing it at Oregon, the 5-star talent, right? And maybe he's not an NFL quarterback. I don't know. He's always been a little bit different of a style of quarterback. But it's the fact that, like you said, Chad Morris. It's like, how is this guy going to ever succeed here? He did everything he could have, even with the skills that we saw him succeed with later. Yeah, and furthermore, we talked about it with this team. This was a really talented team. Pre-Brian Harsin, those defenses were electric. That was Kevin Steele as a defensive coordinator before his attempted coup. And this was the team in 2019 that honestly had the best shot to beat LSU. You talked about you were at that game. The defense was awesome. The special teams were awesome. But they just couldn't call the right plays, which is really frustrating if you're a quarterback because you're like, everything I can see looks like this should work. This is my dad's homeland. I have these great blockers. I have this great defense. Marlon's out there and everything. But alas, they just needed not Chad Morris.
To be fair, there was an element of Bo Nix that I always wondered about with him coming into year 2 of how many of these habits that he has developed in year 1 as kind of this guy that had happy feet for a lot of the first part of his career, how much of this would have overshadowed even having a really good offensive coordinator in year 2. Maybe he wasn't in position to field coaching yet, but we weren't going to find out what that was when Chad Morris got that job. We flat out weren't. And eventually, I'm glad it worked out for Bo Nix. I'm glad that they're now having conversations about, him as one of the first quarterbacks off the board. I still don't quite think he's going to end up being a first-round guy, even though he continues to kind of be in these mocks. TBD on that. I don't really dig into that as much as others do. We will have some draft talk. Senior Bowl is coming up this week. He's going to be a popular topic of conversation. But the career path that he followed, really nothing typical about it. Including the fact that he started more games than anybody ever has at the quarterback position. And his year 2 was very atypical. And I didn't even bring up the fact that his year 2 was 2020. So that was all over the place for everybody, for Bo Nix included. Mm-hmm. Okay, year 2 of Bryce Young. We know what happened. Winning the Heisman Trophy. is not a typical year two progression. That is an outlier. Okay. There was hope that he could do that, right? So it was, I think, an expectation because look at the guys who came before him. Jalen Hurts, Tua, Mac Jones. Mac Jones was a Heisman finalist right before him in his 1 year as a starter. So there was this expectation of, yeah, Bryce Young's going to be really freaking good. Okay. He's one of the 5 preseason Heisman Trophy favorites. I think he ended up being one of the top 3 preseason Heisman Trophy favorites. But we're not discussing what's expected of individual players today. We're talking about what we would realistically expect of a 5-star quarterback in the SEC year 2 on campus. Bryce Young is not the expectation. He is just not. A Heisman Trophy season wherein he was brilliant was, for me, not a fair bar to set for any of these guys that we will eventually be discussing today.
For sure. Yeah. And a guy that has looked better, as time has gone on, honestly, not in the NFL, obviously, but in terms of what we've known about Bama since he left. I mean, the offensive line's pretty much gotten worse. He was at the beginning of the bad offensive lines. Bill O'Brien got to look smart with him, which was tough. And then obviously, he had the 2 pretty good receivers his Heisman year, but we saw what happened when those receivers went down. There was not a ton behind them, and there continues to not be at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, he was really just the last gasp of Alabama as a force, right? You'd see Bryce Young, and he was the spearhead of this scary Alabama team that felt like they're going to beat the stew out of you. So, I mean, credit to him. Yeah, he went above and beyond.
Let's go to Brock Vandagriff, a guy that we've already mentioned here. He was a 5-star quarterback back in 2021. As people remember about his recruitment, it was originally Oklahoma. He's a Georgia native. And then he's like, I'm only going to decommit from Oklahoma if Lincoln Riley's going to the NFL. He didn't end up going to the NFL, but interesting that Lincoln Riley does not end up staying at Oklahoma. Brock Vandagriff may be a little bit of a crystal ball. 2022, Vandagriff was still 3rd string on the depth chart without a real path to playing time because the ageless Stetson Bennett was still around somehow and was, as we know, a Heisman finalist for a national championship winning team. Carson Beck was a year older than Vandagriff, and Stetson basically didn't get touched in half of his games. So we didn't even have Stetson's hurt, we got to bring in somebody else. This wasn't the 2020 Georgia team that we saw that just, obviously was rotating through quarterbacks. Very, very different. I'd argue that not being even close to meaningful snaps does not fall into whatever the median is for typical year 2 progression for a 5-star quarterback in the SEC.
Well, hey, before about 2012, that probably was how it went for 5-star quarterbacks in the SEC. That's just back in the day, it's this here got Star Jackson. Watch out. This guy's going to be so scary. It's guys did not want to have good quarterbacks back in the day. But in the modern era, we realize that quarterbacks are actually effective and helpful. Yeah, those dudes are playing immediately.
I think they wanted to have good quarterbacks. They didn't have the surroundings to maximize great quarterbacks. That's what I think some of it was. And that's not for the entire playoff era of the SEC or anything like that. But there was a good period of time where, offenses just weren't necessarily conducive to that. And some picked schools outside of the SEC as a direct result. Connor Wigman in 2022, he was, in my opinion, heading toward a typical year 2 progression. But like Eason, he got hurt early in the season. And so we can't even count that as a true year 2. Unlike Eason, he got his job back because instead of watching a true freshman lead the program to its first title game berth since the Herschel Walker era, Wigman watched his coach do his job so poorly that the university decided that $77 million was worth it to be done with him. Different situations. Very, very different, I would say. So Wigman, not a typical year 2.
Not quite as bad as Chad Morris, but their coaching was so offensively that they hired Bobby Petrino, and we both went, yep, this is a massive step up. They're going to fix this.
They improved by 11 points per game. It was a step up.
It did get better. We weren't wrong necessarily. It just wasn't enough to overcome Jimbo.
Yeah. Very difficult thing to be able to do for anyone to overcome Jimbo. The fellow 5-star quarterback in the SEC in that class of 2022 was Ty Simpson. Here you go, kid. Your opportunity to win the starting job is in the second half of a week 3 game at USF in what should now be called the Blake Barnett Bowl. But, your offensive line doesn't feel like blocking a soul. And that's going to be your only meaningful snaps of the season. Good luck. There you go. Congrats to you. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that how many guys on this list, though, if you would have given them that, they would have been like, thank God. I mean, the opportunity to win a job against USF in that hostile road environment, I know, still, I feel like he kind of fumbled the bag here because they looked horrible without Milroe.
It was bad. It was really, really bad. And look, I think that there is a path for Simpson to still have a good career. TBD on what it looks like, though, with this new coaching staff. Like that is going to be the thing that he's going to try and overcome. It really will be. I'm not totally selling my Ty Simpson stock. I still have at least some of it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so of that group, this is the crazy thing, right? The only all-conference selections in year 2 were Tua and Bryce. That's it. Those are your year 2 all-conference guys. They're the only guys that were particularly close among the 5-star quarterbacks in the SEC in year 2. Even our last typical year 2 progression for a 5-star guy, Jeff Driscoll, was nowhere near that level in 2012 because all conference honors went to Heisman Johnny Manziel and AJ McCarron, who obviously went on to win a national championship that season. Mm-hmm. That brings us to 2023. The SEC from that class of 2023 has not 1, not 2, but 3 former 5-star quarterbacks who are entering year 2. That's why I wanted to bring this up today. Okay. Mm-hmm. We know that Nico Iamaleava, say it with your chest, Nico Iamaleava, Jackson Arnold, and of course, Arch Manning.
Ever heard of him?
I have heard of him. Obviously, we know that Arch is in a different spot than those two because contrary to what people said when he signed, he's not getting the keys to the Texas offense just yet. That still belongs to Quinn Ewers. I would argue that Arch can still end up falling within the guidelines of typical year 2 progression if Ewers gets hurt for the 3rd year in a row. And it's, maybe he shows some good, some bad. We know that Malik Murphy opened the door by leaving for Duke. We also know that everything Arch does, good or bad, will be magnified to the nth degree because of his last name. I can count on one hand the amount of people that we did an emergency podcast for after a verbal commitment. It's one. It's Arch. Yep. That's it. Him being a backup in a weird way could push that progression talk to the back burner. And that changes if he gets beat out on the depth chart, by Trey Owens, the 4-star true freshman. But I can't imagine that happening. Murphy was older. He was a more polished player. I don't care how it looks in practice. Arch is getting an opportunity to be Ewers' understudy in year 2. Otherwise, Sark is basically saying, yeah, you're going to transfer at the end of this year. But that's all we can really project, right? The weird thing is that if Arch does that and he only plays in garbage time and then he gets to take over the Texas offense in year 3, none of those previous 5-star quarterbacks followed that path either. They're usually transferred out by that point. Some are already starting, or I suppose in the case of Vandegrift, some are still just waiting for their turn in year 3. But a lot can happen in year 2 that can change Arch's path. You could say the same for Iamaleava and Arnold. For those two guys, it can be all over the place. Overall, I would say there's a pretty similar internal confidence with those two. And a lot of that is based on the bowl game. A lot of it. Nico was on the right side of his bowl game. Arnold wasn't. I went back and I watched Arnold in the bowl game. There's a lot to like if you can get over the fact that Oklahoma turned the ball over 6 times that game.
One caveat, one little thing.
Yeah.
Billy, he's a perfect ball player, except
that one thing. Not totally excusing those plays because Arizona definitely did some things that confuse him. And when you throw 2 picks on your first 8 passes, you're doing something wrong. Okay. This is not like he played mistake-free football. But I actually thought he settled in pretty nicely. And I don't think he has happy feet, or at least I didn't see a ton of that. Nor do I think he has the what I call supreme physical confidence that I think you see in college from guys like Fields. I think Levis had it. I think Anthony Richardson had it. I think even Joe Burrow had it to a certain degree, but obviously his pocket presence is far from a knock. It's one of his strengths of what has made him so unbelievably good. Mm-hmm. Arnold is listed at 6'1". I'm not sure he's that big.
Huh.
If he ends up being one of those guys who, like, maybe one day he's at the combine and he's 5'11", it wouldn't surprise me. But he moves well. He moves really well. That will be a major asset early in his career, but hopefully not a default. If he operates like year 2 Jalen Hurts, that'll be a disservice to this offense, which has, in my opinion, one of the best receiver rooms in the SEC. That might be an unpopular take at this point because they're new and we haven't seen these guys against SEC competition. But Jaleel Farouk is kind of this reliable move the chains guy. Nick Anderson, not the guy who missed the free throws against the Rockets. He became one of the big play threats in all of college football, really, as a redshirt freshman last year. Andrell Anthony was the leading receiver on that team until he suffered a season-ending injury. He is also back. And then they added Deion Burks from Purdue. He was the second-team All-Big Ten guy who is going to have significant NFL interest this year. Not sure that they have a true slot guy to be able to replace Drake Stoops, but I think they have enough guys who can fill that void and make the offense a bit more versatile. And that's what I think the hope is this year. So the expectation for Jackson Arnold should not be that he is all SEC. I think the expectation should be that he is one of the league's better quarterbacks. If we're saying that at the end of the regular season, that's a positive. Not all SEC, okay? That's not what I'm saying. That is not a fair standard when you have 5 returning quarterbacks in the conference who started in New Year's 6 bowl games, okay? That's a lot.
That's a stat right there, yeah. This is like
Crazy.
the opposite of what we had in recent years because there was a kind of a QB, I'd say shortage, but a lot of unproven guys. That's a good point. If you're in Hall of pretty good this year, you're in a really good spot.
This is closer to 2022. It very much is, where it felt like, oh man, you got Bryce coming back, you've got Hooker coming back. You feel like that whatever we're going to see in the SEC at the quarterback position, including Stetson Bennett, obviously, is going to be really, really good. And getting one of those spots at season's end is going to be tough. And sure enough, it was. So that context is important because if this were last year, then yeah, the path to all SEC is a little bit different based on what we know about these guys coming into the season. When, this time last year, I'm banging the drum for KJ Jefferson to be the preseason first team all SEC quarterback. These guys will not covet that. They are not going to. If I am a big fan of Oklahoma or Tennessee, here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that my guy goes into next season as a preseason all-SEC guy. Year 3. If they've done enough in year 2 to set themselves up that well in year 3, then that would be a win. If that's the conversation, things will have gone well. But here's a weird stat about Oklahoma quarterbacks. And I think Oklahoma fans know this, but I went back and had to do this digging myself. And I didn't see somebody tweet this out or anything like that. I'm sure somebody has at some point, but it was just something that I wanted to go back and figure out. The last time that Oklahoma had a quarterback who started a game, right, who was there for his entire career was Blake Bell, 2014.
Huh.
Think about it. All these guys, Baker, transfer. Hurts, Murray, transfers. Rattler, transfers out. Caleb Williams, transfers out. Dylan Gabriel, transfers out. That's it. That's the list right there. Trevor Knight, transfers out.
Yeah.
Blake Bell, 2014. That's what we're talking about. It's been 10 years. So obviously the hope is that Arnold can be that guy who's going to start and finish his career at Oklahoma and end up going to the NFL maybe eventually. I don't know if he's a 3-year guy in college or if he's more of a 4-year guy because of his frame, TBD on all that stuff. But the hope is that he's going to start and finish his career and follow this natural progression that you would hope to see as Oklahoma enters the SEC.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting too. When we think about, some of the decisions that have gone into this, you want to stick with your guy in a way, that's part of the Justin Fields thing that we kind of talked about, which is it would create an awkward situation because you can't just say, hey buddy, get on out of here, because then it becomes used against you in negative recruiting and guys say, well, they're just amassing talent. They don't care about you. But Oklahoma is kind of the opposite where it's well, they're just business is open in Oklahoma. There's just free agency. Every quarterback we get here is kind of the hot name guy. We're just going to ride these guys until they leave or whatever. And so, yeah, this is almost kind of a return to, Brace tradition where it's let's actually see if we could just get this kid to commit to college here and just pick out a dorm and just stay in Norman. What about that?
Just chill, get an apartment in your second year, and get maybe stay in the same house or something like that your junior year, and then go to the NFL and be on campus for those workouts and actually be, on a typical college path. Yeah, they just have not had that for whatever reason And so if they can have that with a guy like Jackson Arnold, I think that would be something that fans would appreciate after the way that it's played out. Obviously, most recently with Caleb Williams. The Dylan Gabriel thing's a little bit different. It's not like he started his career there. There's kind of this expectation that he was going to move on eventually as well, just because of the Levy thing. And they knew they want to see Arnold, right? I think Oklahoma fans would rather see this year 2 of Arnold than they would of another year of Dylan Gabriel. As good as he was for his 2 years that he spent there, I still would argue that there is more intrigue with this, especially if there is risk baked in with potentially Arnold transferring in this world of NIL, portal, all that stuff.
Yeah, and with that, you kind of build in another good point, which is that I'm not going to pretend I get in the weeds of Oklahoma recruiting like this, but what that feels like is all the guys that they have kind of hyped up as these heir apparents over the years have not really worked out, because you don't just go get, a Baker Mayfield if your plan is going well. Like, it's just like, oh, this guy's also on the roster and he's crushing it in practice. We'll just start him and kind of figure it out from there. So that's the other thing is the unpredictability of these recruiting rankings. Because now that you say that, it's like, yeah, I feel like they do kind of get a 5-star almost every cycle. How many of those guys really turn out to play for Oklahoma, right? Like you always talk about. And then of those guys, who finishes there, right? So they're actually a great example of modern college football. And they got there with Kyler, like you said, almost 10 years ago. So maybe in that aspect, they're ahead of the curve. But defense, not so much. But with the quarterback part.
That's true. Very true. In a similar but different way, Tennessee also struggling with the whole quarterback who starts and finishes his career here.
Yeah.
Different track record in the late 2010s, early 2020s than Oklahoma had for sure. But nonetheless, a similar problem. At Tennessee, the last quarterback who started a game, who both started his career at Tennessee and exhausted his eligibility with the Vols, or decided I'm going to the draft early. This is my last year here. The last quarterback to do that in Tennessee was Josh Dobbs, 2016.
Really?
Yep.
Wow. So no Garantano?
Finished his career at, where did he finish his career? He transferred to Washington State. Yeah, he transferred to Washington State, I want to say. And after seemingly 15 years in Knoxville, and Jeremy Pruitt trying to convince us that he was going to be a thing. It's amazing to think about how many games Garantano, which that became the pronunciation of his name his senior year when he tried to correct all of us who have been calling him Garantano. It's amazing to think that Garantano was still starting games for Jeremy Pruitt in Jeremy Pruitt's last season, when Pruitt could have just looked at him for a year and been like, nah. I'm going in a different direction. And he had some good games. I mean, I'm not trying to take away from his career and who he was, but he did not finish his career at Tennessee, which is crazy. Very, very crazy.
Well, it's fair just to be, this is a 6-year college guy. As I look at it, he redshirted his first year, then proceeded to play most of the following 4 seasons there. Then he transferred, and in 2021, only played 2 games for Washington State. You're right. Like, that's completely correct. I'm just like, why do I not remember that? Because it was 2 games. It was not that good, and he played more than an entire career worth of games at Tennessee.
Was he a 2016 recruit?
Yeah, he'd be redshirted before that season.
Didn't realize that. I was thinking of him as 2017 recruit who had the, let's call it questionable body language against Georgia Tech in that opener in Atlanta. People remember that. That was a tough game for trash cans everywhere.
Oh, that was the trash can game. Yep.
Yeah, who could forget? So, think about it, though. Dobbs was a second-team All-SEC guy. In many ways, that could be the hope for Nico by the time he finished his career, And if you had just said, hey, the best thing he's going to do in college from an individual standpoint is going to be a second-team All-SEC guy, that sounds underwhelming, right? Doesn't it? I mean, who do like when you hear a 5-star quarterback and you're like, okay, I hope he becomes this. What's your expectation?
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good one as I think about that. It just depends on, larger SEC, right? I'm just everything now I'm second guessing, but you're right. It's like you would think at least, hopefully first team SEC, because then, there's still the Big Ten, there's still other conferences out there to compete with. That doesn't even guarantee you an All-American team membership. So yeah, I think being the best of your conference still matters in that way.
And it's, of course, like that's not part of the recruiting pitch when these guys as 5-star quarterbacks are, shown on the cover of Sports Illustrated, rest in peace, and they're doing the Heisman pose and all that stuff. Like nobody talks about how, it'd actually be great if you were just a second team all conference guy in a Power 5 conference, but that's not sexy. It's just not. But the surroundings for Nico would suggest otherwise. And like, that's not going to be the standard that he is held to, because we know he is the most decorated Tennessee quarterback recruit since Peyton Manning. So that whole thing hangs over him. He's also trying to live up to the Hendon Hooker standard, which was finishing 5th in the Heisman Trophy voting, likely going to New York if he could have stayed healthy. In case that wasn't enough, let's all remember it's the Josh Heupel offense. Before Joe Milton, all 5 of Josh Heupel's offenses as a head coach were top 8. Mm-hmm. As crazy as it sounds, I think that is a fair expectation for Iamaleava in year 2. You know that the run game is going to boost those offensive rankings. Just will. Set it and forget it. That's what the Josh Heupel offense does. You know that you're going to have some of those plays where, we talk about ADOT, average depth of target. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's going to be 2 yards for the first half of a game, and it's going to be really, really low. You're just throwing all these little quick hitters, but it turns into 25 yards because you've got Brew McCoy blocking on the outside and Squirrel White squirts through the defense, something like that. Those plays are baked into the Tennessee offense, and why under Heupel it is so unbelievably efficient. I think pre-injury 2018 Mackenzie Milton would be fantastic. If Nico looks like that, and I'm saying this to you because that's a team that you remember, and people too often forget about Mackenzie Milton as like one of the better college quarterbacks of the playoff era because of the way it ended with him. But before he got hurt that year and he was running the Heupel offense, it was really good. I mean, he was efficient as a passer. He was smart with his legs, especially in the red zone. I'm not saying that I think Iamaleava should finish 6th in the Heisman voting like we saw with Mackenzie Milton, which people forget that. He finished 6th in the Heisman voting that year, and he was really good. But can he just be the guy that runs this offense at a super high level, that gives you moments, that lets you know he is special? Yes. And can he win a ton of football games while doing it? Yes. Obviously, the elephant in the room here with that comp is we're talking about doing that against SEC defenses as compared to doing that against AAC defenses, which that's not a fair comp. It's really not.
Yeah, but Mackenzie Milton would have never done that against an SEC defense.
He played against an SEC defense in the bowl game. Yes, he did. Doing that for an entire season as opposed to doing that against that Auburn team, I'd argue it's a little different.
Yes. And not to do the UCF thing again, but that was, again, you either understand Gus or you don't. It's so funny, the group of people who was like, this is a huge UCF conference win. It's like, but I don't think you really understand Gus and what happened there. Now they see it on a weekly basis. No, I love that cup for Mackenzie Milton because it's not the 37 passing touchdown, like 2017 super high flying one. This is the one that was dialed back a little bit. He did take a small regressive step, but the big thing for him was being able to like punch it at the goal line. He had 9 rushing touchdowns that year. So I think that for Iamaleava, Tennessee's in an interesting place because they're a team that has had their share of bad luck over the last 10, 15 years, but at the same time, they've also had like decent quarterback play at times. Like, it's not like the quarterback play has been the reason why they've been bad. It's kind of been almost everything else because Dobbs was a stabilizer. Like, Garantano, it wasn't really his fault that they were in the positions they were in. He was a fine college starter. He just had, bad coaching.
I would agree to disagree a little bit on that. A little bit.
Yeah, you see what I'm saying, though. It's just the fact that they didn't maximize the guys they had. We've seen guy after guy from Tennessee kind of hit the NFL, and it's like, Alvin Kamara is actually like a top 5 running back immediately. So point being, like, it's not like, you're going to a place where this guy is even going to be in the conversation for the greatest, is where I'm going, because you got Peyton Manning, because you just had Hendon Hooker. Now, again, being the guy not after the guy is the best, because he's going to be better than Bazooka Joe. And furthermore, I would be more willing to bet on him being an all-SEC quarterback next year than I would have on Joe Milton when he got the preseason all-SEC love, because you watch him play football and you go, this guy can play football. Okay. And so point being, like with Joe Milton, it always felt scripted. And so I really do love that comp because that's what people do kind of miss. And we've talked about it ad nauseum. If you listen to us, you do know this, but Tennessee is fundamentally a confusion-based offense, right? It's one that you have to defend the run at all times, or they're going to run it down your throat and never throw the ball. And they would like to have a quarterback like Milton or Hooker who is able to extend plays and bring that third element of, is it going to be a run? Is it going to be a pass? I guess play action would be a third. But then the fourth would be, okay, well, this was called a pass. We defended it correctly. Now this dude's going to take off. We saw that some against Iowa. So I'm very big on him, and he does appear to have at least the smoothness that we've talked about. He has the talent. Now, if he can put it all together against new SEC competition, which, as we've discussed, is going to be the hardest schedule for like every team ever, we'll see.
I almost want to ignore individual stats with Nico. And this is probably the only time in his career which he's going to be able to start games and he's not going to be picked apart for the NFL stuff yet, because he's not going to be draft eligible at the end of 2024. But I would rather have him answer these questions. Is he the type of guy who can lead a 2-minute drill late in a game? Does Heupel have confidence in him to try and get points late in the half when there's 55 seconds left and you've got 2 timeouts and you're on your own 20, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there those explosion games where Tennessee puts up 45 in conference play and it doesn't even look like Nico broke a sweat? Like, are those games that we're seeing from him? And like, you can get into the efficiency stuff and how that would kind of really be a byproduct of not breaking a sweat. To me, that would all be fair. That would all be like, hey, this is the year 2 progression that you're hoping to see because the surroundings are so good and probably atypical compared to a lot of the aforementioned situations that we've talked about with these 5-star quarterbacks in the SEC. And we're going to talk more Nico with Adam Sparks. So I don't want to dig too much into him. This is a very Nico heavy pod today. But those to me are the more interesting questions as it relates to him, as opposed to whether or not he finishes top 10 in Heisman voting, whether or not he's, puts up 35 or 40 touchdowns in a season. Like, get me to that place where you feel like the offense is operating as it should. And then we can have those conversations in year 3 and talk about his legacy and all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the thing that's so funny and like, I guess ironic would be the word, is that all the preseason love for Milton was, number one, he could throw the ball over them their mountains, which is still accurate. Can't take that away from him. Now, does he want to do that? Will he do that? That's a different question. But the other part of it was that this offense was seen as completely quarterback proof. We've seen, all these random guys, DJ, who ended up at Old Dominion. I always joke about that, almost beat LSU in a bowl game. So like, they have basically found a way to squeeze the most juice out of every quarterback, other than Joe Milton, who just wasn't good. Like, I think that was such an indictment on his future, because Josh Heupel was not able to ever really find what he did well consistently. It's like the Stephen A. quote about Kwame Brown, where he's like, he doesn't have one post move he can put to memory and do 2 times in a row. That was Josh Heupel watching Joe Milton play football. And it's like, so point being, I do think that Heupel has earned that. I think he's earned the ability to say, we'll give you a mulligan on Joe Milton. We watched it too. It didn't make a lot of sense, some of those turnovers and decisions he made. And so I think that we can give like Heupel the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, if Nico is 75% of what we saw in the bowl game, Heupel will be able to win with that, turn that into something, and the questions for him were always defense, pace of play, all that stuff. In a way, Joe Milton was a blessing for that, because he couldn't make some of the selfish and kind of short-sighted decisions he made with field position with Joe Milton, because he was not getting that ball back. You know what I'm saying? So that might have actually just made him a better coach. So I'm actually fascinated to see, after that reset and having to coach his butt off for a year, I mean, that was probably a better coaching job, weirdly, despite all the bad things that happened to them. So yeah, I'm so fascinated by where Nico goes.
All 3 could have very different paths. They really could. I mean, it's strange to think about it, and it's almost unfair to include Arch in that category, because we know it's a different situation when one of the best returning quarterbacks in college football is the guy that's starting ahead of you. But I think too with Arch, it's more about, do we want to sell stock with him? Does he lose? Does his approval rating take a hit this season? If you can avoid that, then I think you're still on track. But ideally for Texas, you're not seeing a ton of Arch in meaningful reps in year 2. You're just not. You're just staying healthy, and it's a different circumstance for him than it is obviously for the likes of Arnold and Nico. It's just, I think it's just easy to get like out of whack with these year 2 guys who are former 5-stars, because we have seen it before. We've seen the Bryces, the Tuas, the Caleb Williams, even if you want to get outside of the SEC, Jameis, another, year 2, Manziel, Manziel wasn't a 5-star guy though. Like,
Right.
So like with our eyes are telling us when we see certain throws that this is confirmation bias. This is why they're rated as a 5-star. This is why they should have all of that hype, all of that buildup. And we've seen guys doing it. But like I'm telling you right now, history suggests that at least one of these 3 guys will have an entirely different outlook at this time next year, and not in a good way. Not in a good way. This is the first time since the class of 2006 that the SEC has 3 5-star quarterbacks. And that year, go back to 2006, Stafford, it's Tebow, it's Mustang. Mustang didn't have a year 2. So in many ways, this is the first of its kind with having these types of guys, this type of talent at the quarterback position, potentially taking that next step in this all-important year 2. And by the way, that's not even including the fact that we're probably going to have at least 3 other 5-stars who are QB1s for their respective teams opening day between Wigman and Vandegrift and Ewers. There's probably another that I'm forgetting. Maybe. No, I think that's it. There might be another. Graham Mertz was not a 5-star guy. He was close. People forget MVP of the U.S. Army All-America Bowl. No, I think that's it. I think that's it among the 5-star guys. But man, it is a really, really interesting time at the quarterback position. And those 3 have a path that can go all over the place. It feels like in the SEC.
So this feels pretty easy here, but just to get a level set, how would you rank these guys? Just 1 to 3.
I'd put Nick. I essentially did have to rank them when I did SEC quarterback rankings, which you can find and disagree with on SDS social media. And I started with Nico as the top ranked among these guys. And I had some Florida fans who pushed back and say like, oh, how could you rank Nico ahead of Graham Mertz when we've seen so much more of Graham Mertz? I'm like, I would argue that
because we've seen so much of. What do you mean?
Yeah.
I saw it too.
I don't think you get to go to bang the drum for a guy that was better than I thought he was going to be, but still, what did Graham Mertz do that was more impressive than Nico even in the bowl game and his first career start? Like, and that's not to say that he's going to be better than him throughout his entire career, but still, it confirmed what we have heard throughout this entire process and the limited sample size that we've seen of him. So yeah, I had Nico ahead of someone like Graham Mertz. As it relates to the 2 other 5-stars that we're talking about, I would put Jackson Arnold right behind Nico. I would. And I would put Arch 3rd in that group because that's just right now. That's just right now. Now, obviously, that's different if you talked about where would they all be with NIL valuation if they hit the open market. Entirely different conversation because brand association is different in that era. But I do think that that's how I'd rank them now with Nico, Arnold, and Arch, and not really feeling like 100% it's going to finish that way. But right now where they start, that's how I'd go.
I think NIL evaluation is kind of going to be like the his team would be favored on a neutral field, like of the future, where it's like, well, if this guy transferred, he'd have $1 million in NIL. It's like, well, yeah, he hadn't played a snap yet, buddy. His last name's just Manning. Like, what do you want me to say about that?
Yeah, and look, I'm not. We're not here saying that Arch is going to be a bust or that he's just going to be overvalued because of his last name, but you don't know until you know. The guy's got 5 career pass attempts. He's thrown a pass in 1 game in his college career. It's all TBD. It's all speculation, and there is no sort of guarantee that awaits for his career and how this can all play out in his year 2 with Ewers and what all that looks like. And by the way, Ewers still has another year of eligibility after this one. So keep that in mind. Just saying. Look, he's going to be gone after this year probably, but still another year of eligibility because, 2021, he was at Ohio State. 2020, that's still another year of eligibility. This will be his 3rd year of eligibility that he is using up. All right. Any other thoughts on that before we kick it to Adam Sparks?
No, I think, that's one thing that we've kind of like hammered this part of it may be adjusted TBD with this Ohio State stuff, but it's always been, the 5-star / blue chip stuff. But then converse to that, quarterback's not really the same as the other positions. I think that's been something that we've talked about over and over again. The hit rate on almost every other position is just so much high. Because if you're an offensive lineman and you're a 5-star, the odds of you being 6'7" and bad and not playing for Alabama are really low. You know what I'm saying? And so, point being, you could get through college being a disappointing 5-star, go in the 4th round and wash out as an offensive lineman. As a quarterback, you kind of know next couple of years, unless you're poorly managed like Bo Nix. And so these guys are the most fascinating ones because they can save your offense, a la Jaden Daniels, or they could be. And this is not Bo Nix's fault, but that position group can be the black hole in your offense the way it was in 2019 Auburn. So it's like identifying these guys early. And, like we have all done that thing. Malik Willis, good example. You see a guy kind of play and you're like, hey, he's got that dog in him. I like that guy. Da-da-da. And like, it's maybe because we don't see practice. We form these opinions so early about these quarterbacks. Same deal with Tua. McCarron was the other guy like that I saw fear when I saw him in person. Saw him in 2010, I think LSU. We won that game. And I remember seeing him on the sidelines and just being like, oh my gosh, this guy's huge. He's 6'4", 6'5". He's standing next to like the guys on the roster, like towering over them. Who is this cyborg they brought in? It turned to be multiple-time national champion. And so point being, like, you see, we like to say we knew before everybody with these quarterbacks, even in the age of scouting. And so it's good to just take the temperature and say, who is going to live up to that 5-star? Who's shown us something the way we think we kind of saw it against Iowa with Nico? Who's yet to show something? Who's behind schedule, like some of these guys we talked about? So, yes, it's a real fascinating topic.
How much fear do you think Ryan Perrilloux invoked in opposing fan bases?
I mean, come on, bro. He was going to be like our Tim Tebow. He just could not stay off the weed. That was his problem.
Happens to the best of us.
Yeah, I mean, hey, I work in entertainment. I'm sure, you know what I'm saying? So I think that's another one. And we could go back to, Tebow, number one quarterback, dual threat in this class. But that's another guy that just had a storybook career was he a 5-star?
He was a 5-star. He finished as a 5-star. Year 2 progression of winning the Heisman Trophy, probably not typical.
Yep, that's one that I did want to throw in there. That is the best case scenario ever, which is that this guy came in year 1, played meaningful reps for the championship team. Year 2 was the Heisman, and it's like, yep. And so, yeah, I guess that and Bryce Young are kind of your top level guys. And at the bottom, you got Mustaine or whatever, just dudes that never play.
Maybe the year 2 progression is like the median, I guess is what we would call it, is like Driscoll to Stafford, right? And it's like everything that's in between that is typical year 2, or at least we should deem it as typical and kind of the expectation, falling somewhere in that group. And then way up here is Tua and Bryce and Tebow and in that group and what they ultimately became. But yeah, good luck trying to predict it.
And I will say this really quick before we get out of here. One thing that you've keyed it on too, like in other podcasts, is that like we're talking about the honeymoon period for one of these guys. That period doesn't even exist anymore because of the transfer portal. So it's like your honeymoon period is the time between when you commit and when the season starts. Because if you're not playing, then there's number one friction of like, is this guy going to leave us? And then there's the number 2 friction of, well, this guy's not good enough to play. What's going on? And so it's so weird because even just having that guy on your roster now, it's like a nuclear warhead. It's like you got to know exactly what to do with it, because if you end up like modern someone, you're a failure and you can't manage quarterbacks and you'll never get another one again because this guy transferred. And so now it's like a hot potato in a way. It's like we got to get this guy on the field, get him winning games, get him out of here so that we can tell other quarterbacks. Because if you hit a snag in that, like Kirby was seen as like the QB killer for 3 or 4 years and just could not get a guy in the building, had to get the dude from Wake Forest. And then finally it was like, you know what? They're trying to win football games here. If you come here as a 5-star, you might get benched. That's just what it's going to be, dude. Sign up or don't.
And it's a difficult thing to have to manage. So, as much as we talk about how easy it is with some of these decisions, it is definitely not. Kirby is a reminder of that, and he's won despite that in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's kick it to Adam Sparks. It's an interesting offseason for Tennessee, so a lot of things to be able to discuss with him and with Heupel and with Nico and all the different offensive pieces. Can they replace some of those guys on the defensive side? So here's Adam. I'm not excited to be joined by a very special guest. It is the Knoxville News' Adam Sparks. Adam, the last time we spoke on these airwaves, spring ball was in full effect. We were kind of discussing what this offense was going to look like, where Joe Milton was at, where Nico Iamaleava, still crushing the pronunciation of that, where it was going to look with him in this offense, what kind of speed he was going at, the confidence, and, how drastic does this feel a year later to talk about someone that obviously what he did in the bowl game sent his stock pretty much through the roof among Tennessee fans?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just sort of confirmed what we thought we would see from Nico. Good job on the pronunciation. We go with Nico around here. Iamaleava, first reference, but after that, Nico. he confirmed what we thought. I mean, he's a 5-star talent, and we all know what 5-star talents look like. It's just sort of the intangibles and those sort of things that you want to see come into play. And we saw that in the Citrus Bowl. I mean, there's obvious it's ripe with chances for overreaction. He passed for like 150 yards. So you say, so what? But he accounted for 4 touchdowns, and Iowa has, at least on paper, a top 10 defense, and he looked completely comfortable. Rushed for 3 touchdowns. We saw that extra element that maybe Joe Milton didn't have, which is that sort of like improvisation thing that Hendon Hooker certainly had. So Nico has that as well. I think what I took away from the Citrus Bowl was that he looked comfortable. He ran the offense. His poise was really good. Just sort of, all these words, poise, moxie, whatever you want. He had all those things. It's been a discussion around Knoxville and in Tennessee whether or not they should started Nico earlier in the year. I think you can make that case that there was a chance maybe in November, but I've told Tennessee fans really since the Citrus Bowl, the Nico that you saw in the Citrus Bowl would not have been the Nico that you would have seen, for example, in the Swamp back in September. He just wasn't ready. He wasn't running the offense efficiently. He had to learn it. He had to sort of just, get his feet under him and get used to the tempo and all that. And once that happened, probably around October, November, he was ready to go. And his stock is, his stock's pretty high. We can overreact from the Citrus Bowl, but I think just the little snippets that we saw, I think tells us more that like the Citrus Bowl was probably closer to his floor than his ceiling. And if that's the case, then Tennessee doesn't have a question at quarterback. Could have questions elsewhere, but it's probably not at quarterback.
Did Joe Milton get benched for the bowl game, or was that really an opt-out?
It was an opt-out. It seems like sitting on the fence to say it was mutual. But Joe Milton was going to start the Citrus Bowl. I think Tennessee was perfectly pleased that he decided to opt out. Like, I think internally the feeling was we would like to hand this over to Nico and be able to go into 2024 getting a good look at Nico. But I don't think Josh Heupel was ready to bench Joe. There was a sense of loyalty that he stayed around, that he fought through the being benched for Hendon Hooker sort of thing, that he stayed around another year. He played okay, this past season. He was not great. He was okay. There were times within the season that if they wanted to pull Joe and put in Nico, they had every opportunity, and Josh Heupel would not do it. And so I don't think he was going to do it in the Citrus Bowl either. I think for Joe, he felt a sense that he needed to finish the season and not, quote unquote, abandon his team sort of thing. I think once he went, this is some sort of speculation, but I think once he went to Josh Heupel on the Tennessee and let that be known, I don't want to abandon my team. And they said, hey, it's okay. We're cool with it. We're fine to move on to Nico. And I think you can surmise that because he didn't, like, he's from Orlando, so he was already home for the Citrus Bowl. They brought him into practice. He sort of became a coach, an extra coach. He was there on the sideline. It was sort of this smooth transition, like Joe's still our guy and we thank him for everything, but he was not benched. He was going to play. I think Tennessee was plenty pleased though that he decided to opt out so they could move forward with Nico.
Yeah, Joe served a purpose. He served his purpose as the bridge the gap guy. I mean, for those who assume, as you mentioned, that we would have seen that guy in the Swamp, we would have seen Nico play at this level early in the season. It's not a fair thing to piece that together when we talk about how important it is to have that comfortability in the offense. And even though I had frustrations, I'm sure Tennessee fans had frustrations of how limited the offense felt at times, especially with the inability to throw off platform like we saw from Hooker and like we expect to see from Nico. Like, you can still say, well, he did what you kind of hoped he would do. And the floor could have been so much worse. It really could have been so much worse than it actually was. Do you feel like, when do you feel like was the point though, where you realized that this wasn't going to be, hey, this wasn't going to be Hendon Hooker 2.0? Like, when did we probably collectively had that moment? Is it too easy to say it was Florida, to say that Joe Milton wasn't going to turn out to be this revelation and they were going to maximize this ungodly arm talent?
I mean, I guess it depends on who you ask. If you're asking me, obviously you are. I thought this was a 9-3 football team. They ended up being 8-4. They went Citrus Bowl. They go 9-4. The funny thing is if Tennessee, a 9-3 SEC team, is supposed to finish at the Citrus Bowl. That's sort of where a 9-3 team goes. They ended up swapping with LSU because LSU had been to the Citrus Bowl the year before, and so they actually ended up where they were. I predicted they would be about a 9-3 team. They were just one loss fewer to get there at 8-4. I think Texas A&M at midseason was probably the game for me. Joe threw for 100 yards in that game. I think it was a couple of picks. Tennessee still won it in a defensive struggle. It wasn't just that the numbers were bad, 100 yards passing. It was that you could tell Tennessee was just trying to protect itself from Joe. Like he was not a strength, he was a liability in that game. And Hendon Hooker was never a liability for Tennessee. And so you could see how limited they were, that they didn't have, immense confidence in Joe. They were just going to take the good and the bad with him, and that's sort of what he was. I wouldn't say the Florida game because Cooper Mays, the starting center, all SEC center, was out of that game. They didn't really have a backup plan for that. And so the noise and the penalties on the offensive line, all the pre-snap penalties, really didn't even give Joe a chance. So I would say it was more the A&M game because you could see outwardly of what the thoughts were inwardly in the coaching staff, which is Joe is limited. We can only do what Joe can do, but he can't do everything. And in that way, that told you that it just, it was going to be okay, but it was never going to be great this season.
I try to set the expectation for Nico in the first part of this episode. Where do you stand on that? What's a fair expectation for Nico, knowing all the things that are going to be said and written about him during this 8-month offseason?
If he's healthy, and that's a big if. He's still underweight. He's gained some weight, but he's still underweight. He likes to run the ball. He's a little hesitant in getting rid of the ball, which any freshman would be, and so he's going to take some hits. So the big if is if he's healthy. If he's healthy, I think he's got. I mean, he can whip the ball in terms of throwing it down the field as well as anybody of that age that you're going to see. He's just got a great arm. Doesn't have a Joe Milton arm, but that who does? Hendon Hooker was really really good and had a B+ arm. Nico's got a really good arm, really really good sort of an improv runner. He's got a great instincts. There was one of his touchdowns, I think it was the third touchdown in the Citrus Bowl. It was supposed to be a pass. He bootlegged out to the left, and he's looking to throw, and you can see the calculus, the math in his head of thinking, he's at like the 7-yard line. If I get this close to the goal line, I can beat that linebacker to the goal line. And he beat him by about 2 inches and got the touchdown. Joe Milton didn't have that. Hendon Hooker did. In that just sort of that natural instincts to create a play. He's going to make a lot of plays like that. I think Nico's wow plays next season will be greater than sort of his numbers will be. I think he'll put up really good numbers, but I think he'll have some wow plays where the sense will be more of like, just think of what this kid could do if he puts it all together. He's going to have some really, really good seasons. Heisman candidate. I think that's unfair to put on anybody. I've seen he has betting odds because Tennessee puts up a lot of points. Usually it's a really good offense. And if you're good at quarterback, you're going to put up real big numbers. So I understand that, but a lot of wow plays. I don't think he'll be a liability. I think he'll be a strength. He'll get better as the year goes on, and the schedule is manageable in the first half to not play great and still win some games. This is I think the floor is 8-4. I think the ceiling's 10-2 in a playoff team. Because I think any 10-2 SEC team's probably got a pretty good shot at the playoffs. If you look at Tennessee's schedule, NC State is week 2. That's a neutral site game. That's a good opponent. Grayson McCall, the Coastal Carolina quarterback, is there, so they've got a really, really good quarterback. He's going to be facing off against a high caliber quarterback. a good but not great defense. So that'll be a test. If he can beat NC State, Florida is at home. Florida's not going to be very good, but it's still Florida, and Tennessee has this hex that it's tough to get over against Florida. If you win that one, Oklahoma is the toughest test of the first half of the season. It's Josh Heupel's homecoming. Oklahoma's a top 25 team. It's on the road. That'll be Oklahoma's first SEC game, so there'll be a lot of buzz around that game. I could see under Nico, again, if he's healthy, Tennessee being 4-2 at midseason. I could see Tennessee being 6-0 at midseason, and Alabama comes in that seventh game to Neyland. So, there's a chance to have something special by the time the Alabama game comes. There's also a chance of, playing pretty well but having a couple of hiccups in there. I think it is manageable, though, for Nico.
Part of the conversation with him and his outlook is the surroundings. The surroundings are really good. I mean, I think with having Brew and Squirrel back and then adding Brazel from Tulane, and you've got the 5-star Matthews coming in, it just feels like he's going to have a lot of different weapons, and there's going to be more room for error than what this past Tennessee offense had. Do you feel like it's fair to say this should be a receiver room that looks maybe not the upside of the 2022 group where you have a Blitnikoff winner in Hyatt, but a group that's a little bit closer to that can beat you in different ways and feels like it is so quarterback friendly with the ways that they can attack a defense?
There's a lot of variables, I think, in this receiving core. The sort of the assumption with Josh Heupel after the first two seasons was if you plug in a quality receiver into his offense, they'll just put up big numbers. He bats 1,000 on those. That was the assumption. He took Jeremy Pruitt's leftover receivers, Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman, who hadn't done much when he got them, and that's a Biletnikoff winner and an All-SEC 1,000-yard receiver. He took transfers, Velus Jones Jr., and turned him into All-SEC receiver, Brew McCoy, a really, really good receiver. He took Javonte Payton, who was sort of a cast-off from Mississippi State, and made him one of the best deep threats in the SEC. So the assumption after 2 years was you give Josh Heupel receiver, he's going to be really, really good. That narrative sort of went sideways last season with Dante Thornton. He was the Oregon transfer who was a pretty good deep threat but hadn't put it together at Oregon. He didn't work out this season. And so now you've got a lot of Tennessee fans suddenly thinking, maybe it wasn't all Josh Heupel. Maybe it was Hendon Hooker. I think the right answer is actually sort of the Belichick-Brady answer, which is it Brady or is it Belichick? What's the marriage of the two? And so if they get the marriage of the right quarterback with Josh Heupel's offense, then those wide receivers are going to put up big numbers. The variables are that, is Brew McCoy healthy? Took a gruesome ankle injury last year. He's coming back. If he rehabs and gets back to 100%, he's a very good physical receiver. They didn't have that this past year, a guy that can block and hit and catch a short pass in Josh Heupel's offense with those wide splits and do something with it after the catch. So that's a variable. Squirrel is a really good 2. He's not a 1. He's a guy that he needs to be a complementary receiver. That's how you're going to get the best out of him. So they've got to have a 1. Maybe that's Brew McCoy. Brazel, the wide receiver from Tulane, on paper looks like he could be a real difference maker, but he looks a lot like Dante Thornton. So, suddenly we have some doubts about whether he's going to turn out. By the way, also Dante Thornton looked really good for about a game right before he got injured and was out for the year. They had started him in the slot, moved him to outside receiver. He got out there, got comfortable, made a couple of good catches a touchdown pass against Missouri, and tears up his leg. Play. He's out. Yeah, got out that play. So it looked like it was maybe he's the guy this year. They got a 5-star wide receiver, Mike Matthews. So there's a lot of options. If that wide receiving core can sort of take the next step, and those coin flips I just mentioned all go the right way, then yeah, this could be a really, really good offense. They're going to run the ball with Nico. He's a good runner. Every offense that Josh Heupel's ever had they've always run the ball regardless of whose your personnel is. with what they've done around Nico a lot, I think this is sort of a storyline that hasn't get picked up as much nationally or certainly around the conference, is that where a lot of SEC teams went into the portal and spent a lot of NIL money to get guys, Ole Miss is an obvious one. Tennessee didn't go as much into free agency. They re-signed their veterans, so to speak, if you want to put it in pro language. They have 3 starting offensive linemen back, all that were sort of those COVID senior types. It could have gone to the NFL, been done. They did it on the defensive line too. So they re-signed guys. I think they got a little bit of an NIL bump, and that's how they kept guys on the roster. And so a lot of the offensive line stuff, a lot of that was, we got to help Nico. You need to put the protection around Nico. They signed. They got a 5-star transfer, Lance Hurd. He spent a year, I think, at LSU. Was going to be LSU starting tackle. Now they got him again. It's the NFL mentality. You have a potential franchise quarterback. You put the pieces around him, and they certainly have enough pieces to utilize Nico.
Brazel's interesting. The SEC has always had the last, 3 years really that at least 1 or 2 transfer receivers that step into the conference, and you're just like, whoa, this guy has figured it out, and he has to be part of that because of what we've seen from him already at Tulane. And if you're a Tennessee fan listening to this going, man, maybe this is just Dante Thornton 2.0, while it does feel like a bit of a correction to that move, and like maybe he could kind of satisfy that role. I was looking back at some of the stuff that he did last year, and Nick Baumgartner had this stat about how he's first in the country in catches that went for a first down or a touchdown. And so, he did that at the group of 5 level. He's still a guy that is improving and kind of figuring out who he is, whereas Thornton was in a little bit of a different spot, much lower volume, obviously, at Oregon. And Brazel comes in having been the leading receiver for a good team, a team that looked like it was on its way to a New Year's Six Bowl. What's the expectation for his role, kind of what it's gonna look like, and how does he fit into this offense with the things that they want to be able to do?
I think you point out a good contrast between him and Thornton. As I think Thornton, there's a little bit of an identity crisis there. He didn't quite know who he was. They didn't know how to use him. I think Brazel will come in where they'll have more of a sense of how to use him. He's going to go to the outside. If Brew McCoy is healthy, he'll be opposite Brew McCoy. Josh Heupel has always been good about scheming guys open, especially on vertical routes. They didn't hit vertical routes this past year. They didn't hit stuff over the middle. I think Brazel is the type of guy that could stretch a defense in that way. The thing is, Tennessee uses 3 wide receivers. Now, a 4th will get into the game, into the rotation by midseason because you always have injuries or something like that. But they use 3 guys. Any given game, you have 3 guys they're going to start with, and they're going to finish with those 3 guys if there's no injuries. They don't rotate. They're the fastest operating offense in the country, so that means they just don't sub. You start a series, you finish a series. So Brew McCoy's healthy. That's Brew McCoy. That's Squirrel. And then if Brazel's the 3rd guy, then he's going to have every reason to think he's going to put up big numbers. If he's not the 3rd guy, there's a big difference between 3 and 4 in this offense. So does Thornton beat him out because Thornton has had an extra year? They had 2 guys that played in place of Brew McCoy when he got injured. Do they take another step? Does Mike Matthews, the 5-star, get a chance? I would put my money on Brazel above the other guys because I think he does have more of the upside, the immediate upside. But we'll see. We'll see. I think spring is going to be really important for him. He's a vertical. They need a vertical guy. They need a guy with some length, sort of a Cedric Tillman type, and he doesn't have to have blazing speed. In this offense, we've seen guys schemed open. Cedric Tillman, Ramel Keaton, Javonte Payton. Those are not like 4.35 type guys. Those are guys that run like 4.5s, but they somehow would get open for deep balls. Tennessee can do that. Some issues with Joe Milton last year. He had the best arm in college football, and for whatever reason, could not throw enough accurate deep balls, or sometimes just would not see the deep balls that were open. Nico's going to have to do that, and they feel like he can. You saw glimpses of it in Citrus Bowl. They saw glimpses of it late in the season in practice. If he can do that, then guys are going to get open, and Brazel, I would think, is going to be the biggest beneficiary of that.
I think if you look at the bookends of the season, you come up with the question, why didn't Dylan Sampson get more run? And that's something I find myself asking, because obviously, you know, it wasn't like Tennessee's ground game was hurting, but you see the way that he ran the football against Iowa when he finally gets to kind of take over the backfield. And not to hate on Jalen Wright or anything like that, but you just see a guy that's got that burst and is part of the reason why there is this optimism about Tennessee's offense next year. Why wasn't he in spots to be able to get more of those reps? Was it just about the pass blocking? Like, what was it with him?
That was some of it. I mean, one burden he had was he was behind Jalen Wright. I thought was certainly one of the best running backs in the SEC, one of the best in the country. Jalen Wright this season is what Dylan Sampson would like to be this coming season. I think they're somewhat similar backs. Jalen Wright was he was better at this past season. He was better. Dylan Sampson could become Jalen Wright. He has a ton of ability. I never really had the question of why is Dylan Sampson not playing ahead of Jalen Wright. I had the question, why is Sampson not playing ahead of Jabari Small?
That's a better way to phrase it. Yep.
Who's a veteran, a very serviceable back, pretty good in short yardage around the goal line, had a nose for the goal line. But your best two were Wright and Sampson. And they went to Sampson more late in the season. They started to make that turn late in the year. Sampson was frustrated that he didn't get into the Florida game. You're trying to figure out ways to create yards, and you've got a guy standing on the sideline who creates plays, catching, running, whatever, and he just couldn't get in the game. I think in retrospect, that was probably an error. They needed to find a way to get him into the game. I think this year, Tennessee's offense was more robotic than it's ever been with Josh Heupel. Even back to UCF, his days there, it was a grind. It was trying to figure out what the quarterback did best. When Cooper Mays was out in the Florida game and early in the season, every question they had was, how do you protect the quarterback? Because you don't have a center. You're getting, pre-snap penalties, so you're in 1st and 15. And Dylan Sampson was not. He was their third best pass protector of the running backs. And so I think some decisions early in the season were made of trying to prevent the worst thing from happening rather than trying to do the best thing. And Dylan Sampson was more of the best case scenario, but he was also the worst thing that could happen when he's in the game, which is, to give up a sack. And they were very cautious, I guess is a way to put it. They were less cautious late in the year when Sampson got his feet under him. And, it's his time. I think sometimes fans do it. We get it in the media that we get impatient in looking at a young talent. Why isn't this young talent playing like right now? Where you and I both grew up thinking, you watch as a freshman, you play a little bit as a sophomore, and you might start as a junior and you excel as a senior. And obviously those days in the portal era are gone, but I think we've kind of sometimes gone the opposite end, where we're saying, why isn't Nico playing, at Florida? It's, come on, he's a freshman, he's ready, he's had 15 practices, or whatever. And then we look at the same way we all do. We look at Dylan Sampson and saying, that guy was great against Kentucky. Why isn't he starting? Well, he wait his turn. He's going to get his turn. And Citrus Bowl, he got his turn, looked great, and he's going to be, he'll be RB1 this next season.
Heupel is entering year 4. Where do you think his approval rating is among Tennessee fans? Because I feel like it's still very high, and I was reminded of that when I ranked him behind Stoops in my SEC coach rankings, which Tennessee fans are getting after my mentions right now. I get it, the 0-3 record that Stoops has against Heupel, get all of that stuff. But where is he at going into year 4? Are Tennessee fans feeling like, hey, this guy has done exactly what we could have hoped? Is there a feeling of, you know what, that year 3 kind of wasn't what we were looking for? Like, where do you sense the overall temperament of the fan base is with Heupel?
Well, the honeymoon is over, and I don't mean that as like a strict criticism against him, a harsh criticism. The honeymoon is over in that now we can sort of judge him by like his pros and cons. through 2 seasons, that was the honeymoon phase. It was Tennessee fans looking at this and saying, just won 11 games. This is the floor. It's going to be, a playoff shot every year from here on out. And I think there was a come down to earth more this season. He after 2 seasons, he was an A plus. I'd say most Tennessee fans look at him as an A minus, maybe a B plus. We saw some warts in his offense. Not every quarterback works out with Josh Heupel. Not every receiver works out with Josh Heupel. The assumption that whatever 11 guys he puts out there is going to score 40 points, we got a realization this year that that's not always going to happen. So I would say at this point, it's a really high grade. With Tennessee fans, as any fan base, you have sort of a separation of the realistic portion of the fan base, which says, hey, you're winning 7-8 games a year under, in the Kiffin to Dooley to Butch to Pruitt, eras. Tennessee won 8 games in the regular season this year. That would have been the best year of all those other coaches. Butch won 9 games twice, and that was the pinnacle. This was Josh Heupel's down year, and he went 9-4. So there are realistic fans that look at it like that and say this is good of shape as the program could be. But then there's another portion of Tennessee fans that never ever want to take a step back, and they wanted Hendon Hooker again. They wanted the 2022 offense again. You beat Alabama and everybody rushes the field and carries the goalposts away. You've done that. We know you can do that. So how come you didn't do it again the next year? There's a hunger in the Tennessee fan base that they loved that. They want to get more of it. And so I think both of those groups are sort of like waiting to see what happens with Nico. The marriage between this coach and this quarterback is going to tell the story a lot about where this coach is viewed, because Nico's a 5-star. Tennessee has not signed a 5-star quarterback in about 20 years. They haven't had a 5-star quarterback with sort of this pomp, this celebration since Peyton. And you've got an offensive head coach. You've got a quarterback guru as a head coach, and you've got maybe the best quarterback in the country in his class. And all those things are aligned. So you've got to win at a high level while you have him. I think sort of the sense I've heard from Tennessee fans is if you can't get to the playoff with Nico, you're never going to get there. So that sort of puts the pressure on Josh Heupel that, hey, you got 2 years. He'll be draft eligible after 2 more seasons. He's got 2 seasons with Nico, and he'll be draft eligible. Maybe you get him for a third. Who knows, in the NIL era. You can make more money than Brock Purdy as a college quarterback. so maybe you get him for more than that. But you've got him guaranteed for 2 seasons. And I think there's even more sort of a micro pressure on this coming season because they've got the offensive line back. They've built up the rest of the offense for 2024 to be the year, because they'll lose a lot of their O-line and D-line in 2025. And who knows how they're going to rebuild that for Nico's third season. But it sort of all lines up now. You got to win 10 games and get to a playoff, and that is a success. If you don't get to the playoff with Nico in his 2 seasons as a starter, it's a failure. And so Josh Heupel could go back up to an A+, or he could drop down to a B- based on what he does in 2 seasons as Nico as the starter.
It's funny because I think the variance with Heupel is probably more than what some realize of what the conversation could be by this time next year. There's a world in which he could be considered by many one of the 7 or 8 best coaches in the sport, not just in the SEC, but like in the sport. Or alternatively, if it doesn't look good this year again, we know how this works in the SEC. If you have 2 disappointing seasons in a row, it's kind of like, maybe going into year 3, there's questions about your future and about your job. And then it becomes a pressure-packed season, hot seat, call it what you want. But that is still among the range of possibilities for Heupel. I trend more on the opposite side. I've already explained why I think Tennessee deserves to have expectations to make the 12-team playoff. Do you see that playing out this year? Is that kind of how you're anticipating going through this long offseason, talking about Tennessee fan expectations and trying to keep them in check as much as possible?
Yeah, I mean, Playoff it's a reasonable expectation. If I was in Vegas, I wouldn't put money on it, but I think it's a reasonable expectation. My prediction of the season will probably change 10 different times once we go through spring practice and another portal phase and see what everybody else has. See what happens at Alabama if more happens with defections there. But I think this is probably like a 9-3 team. Again, I thought it was a 9-3 team last year. I think this is probably a 9-3 team, which means they have the expectation to go 10-2 or 8-4. 10-2 is a playoff team. I think you really have to get down to the schedule. Will they beat Georgia? I don't think so. They could, but I don't think so. So they got one more loss in there and still make a playoff. You got Alabama at home. What's Kalen DeBoer's Alabama look like? Is that a more winnable game? I think it probably is. Do you win at Oklahoma? Maybe. I mean, how many really tough games are on the schedule? Maybe 4. If you win 2 of those 4, then you're in a playoff. And I think the fun thing about the playoff expanding is that you've got so many. If we just look in the SEC, you've got so many more teams now that are were on the fringe of the playoff before that can reasonably say any given year that they can get in. Ole Miss was not going to get into a 14 team playoff. A 12-team playoff, yeah, that's reasonable. Tennessee, same thing. Auburn, same thing. Missouri, same thing. And you can go down the list. LSU has an easier path to the playoff now. Florida, if they get the right coach, can get in there any given year. So, before you had to be the top team in the SEC or maybe the top 2. Now you can be the top 4 and get into the playoff. And Tennessee any given year can be in the top 4, and I think this year they can. It's about the quarterback and the coach being on the same page. It's about utilizing the pieces that they've added. But really a lot of it is about how much of a complete team can they be. Tennessee, each of Josh Heupel's 3 seasons, they've gotten better on defense. They were awful on defense his first year. They were good enough his second year, sort of the bend, don't break type. This year, they were a little better than that. Their defensive line is pretty good against the run. They have a very good pass rush. James Pierce is Tennessee's best player. It's not Nico. It's not Dylan Sampson. Yeah, it's not Cooper Mays. It's James Pierce. And again, we talk about when is the year? This is his year. He'll be in the NFL a year from now. So it lines up for this to be the year, 2024. You've got an elite first-round talent pass rusher. You've got your 5-star quarterback. You've got the pieces on offense. You've got an offensive line. You're going to be favored to win, depending on how the season goes, 9 or 10 games. And so if you're right on that line, then you can do it. It's within range. So I think it's very reasonable for Tennessee to have expectations of making the playoff. But if you're talking about 3 or 4 in the SEC making it, I think probably about 7 teams in the SEC think they're in that pool. The ones that I just named and some others are looking at it and saying, if this goes right and that goes right, you can get into the playoff. And I think it's going to put even more of a burden on coaches now, that each season is going to be pass or fail. Pass is the playoff. Not making the playoff is fail. And for teams like Tennessee that are probably going to be on the fringe of a lot of things, that's how people are going to look at it.
You just said about 6 things that I feel like I've said in the last few weeks on this show. So that was spot on. Couldn't agree more. Adam, great stuff, man. Really appreciate the time. We'll do this again soon.
Yep. Good to be on.
Jersey contest, Will. We have our first lacrosse jersey. Did not know that we were going to get a lacrosse jersey in this contest, but here we are. I thought it was a soccer jersey when I first saw it.
Yeah, man. This is the Redwoods, or as I call them, the Thick Bears. This is a Miles Jones jersey. Miles Jones is super cool. He is a good example of we always joke about, what would happen if LeBron played soccer. You know what I'm saying? America is good at what they care about. Miles Jones is a 6'5" freak of nature who plays in the PLL, right, the Premier Lacrosse League, and he is just basically the phenom of lacrosse. He's made all-star teams in 2 of the different leagues, first in the MLL, where he was drafted number 1 overall, and then secondarily in the PLL. which is kind of the newer, better league right now. The PLL I often talk about in marketing because they did a great job of combining two things that are hard to do, which is a grassroots level of the sport, right, with the star power, right? So those guys all kind of like came together, started getting all the talent. And so it's super cool to watch this league kind of market itself. And so one of my buddies is a big lacrosse guy. He put me on them early. And I had to have the jersey with the thick bear on there, supporting my boy. And it's just a cool athlete that I like.
Paul Rabel, shout out to him. Is he the GOAT of lacrosse?
Yeah, and I mean that's the cool part of that is he's been an instrumental part of the PLL and kind of bringing everything together. And so yeah, it's just been cool to see these guys who are kind of larger than life stars. And the thing about lacrosse that they've always said is a lot of them were actually teachers in the off season because of the payment plan and everything. So these guys are just real. If you ever watch them on social, they're some of my favorite athletes to follow because they don't try to do the whole like, oh, I'm better than you, I'm an athlete. It's like, oh, just getting my dry cleaning done today. How's it going, y'all?
Yeah, just typical dudes who wear jerseys with large bears on them. You know,
yeah, just like me for real.
Yeah, my team. I literally support a team with bear as the mascot, and
two of them, in fact. Some would argue.
Some would
small
say
bear?
the small bear. Yes, don't have the thickness of the bear that is on that jersey for just the listening audience. For those who can't see this, when we do the voting, just remember that there is a chunky bear that is right smack dab in the middle of this jersey. The colors. He is lurking. That's the eyes on that bear are pretty good too. That's pretty good. Does it have eyeballs on it? It's just yellow.
It's just yellow. He's leering, gleaming at you, waiting for you to make the first move.
We got bears right down the street, man. Right down the street from us. They're everywhere in certain areas in Central Florida. People don't realize that. They are. They very much are.
Just as if there's not enough crazy stuff in the woods in Florida, there's also bears. And one thing about bears, Connor, they often don't start fights, but they will finish them.
Yes, they will. They very much will. All right, let's continue with animals. We have the same lad of the week, right? I assume. Mm-hmm. It's Q. It's Q. Rest in peace to the most successful UGA ever, UGA X, as he is known. 2 national titles, 3 title game appearances. Survived a life-threatening attack from that dumb steer Bevo. Pooped on Corso's foot. It's just a damn good dog. It's a damn good dog. And it lived a great life, contrary to what certain PETA might suggest. If you go back and read the story, I think it was the LA Times who wrote that story of the living conditions of UGA at the Rose Bowl that year, and how I think UGA had a penthouse suite ahead of the Rose Bowl. And you realize, yes, just the natural French Bulldog deals with a lot of problems. It's something that it has prevented me from wanting to just be like, yeah, let's just go tomorrow, get a French Bulldog and do it. The living problems, it is not the best quality of life just for the animal in general. But this animal lived a great life and got so many boops. Oh my gosh. What the amount of things that dog saw on the sidelines, unbelievable. And what a time to be able to do it. I don't know that there will ever be another UGA X. I don't think that the legacy will ever be, I don't want to say it'll never be repeated, but when you're kind of the first to break through at Georgia, man, like that's the amount of imitation UGAs that Georgia fans possess is higher than you think, by the way.
One of them by a fellow SEC football coach.
This is true. Sam Pittman.
Yep.
Good old Lucy. Lucy's doing well, I hope. Gosh, I ask that question every single year. Hopefully we'll get Pittman on at some point in the next couple of months. I'll ask, how's Lucy doing? I'll kind of be waiting on bated breath. Like, don't tell me that dog died. I can't take that news. That's not the news I want to break. No, nothing, but everything is good. The doctor has said nothing but positive things. But yes, R.I.P. Q. A great life for a damn good dog.
Yeah, and mine was the same. I think that it's like poetic in a way, right? Because that kind of represented the resurgence of Georgia football. It's like, how could this be the greatest UGA, right? We have the one that almost bit the Auburn player. We have the legendary UGAs from back in the last national championships. We have the ones that met the legendary coaches, legendary players. And yet, he found a way. He did it his way. The image that always lasts for me is the one in the rain where he's just slumped over asleep in the rain. That was so cute. I loved him so much. His ongoing, just legendary battle with PETA where they would just be like, oh, this dog, terrible living conditions. And then, like you said, people would just be like, this guy's living better than us, pal. What do you mean you're sorry for Uga? Uga is living the dream. He gets boops. He gets first-class food, amenities. His wardrobe is bigger than mine. He's looking fresh every day. He has a human mascot devoted to himself. That's the crazy thing. I mean, the man Uga is a tribute to the small, tiny Uga, who just gets to look at him and be like, look how silly you look. Get me some food. And so, yeah, I think that, he got to meet Quavo. He got to do all these incredible things. And so he lived more, in his shorter life and in his tiny life than we have in ours. And I think that that's, just a way to live. It's like, if you're going to go out, be fabulous. He's got the giant block G on his little jersey. He's got the big smile and, he lit up people's hearts. So I think that, it's your watch is over, buddy. You've been through a lot. You've seen the down years, you've seen the up years, and that's on to the next era. And we will miss you.
For all we know, those players on Georgia's national championship winning teams, they would look over to the sideline and they would think to themselves, man, all the pressure, it's all worth it. Everything's going to be fine. I see that steadying presence over there. Maybe I gave him a little boot before the game. I see how steady that dog is, probably sleeping in an air conditioning doghouse.
If Uga can be asleep right now, I should not worry.
Look, everything's going to be fine. Everything is going to be okay. And Q, the resume is unmatched. I talked about it last week, how I wasn't willing to give athletic directors national championships. I'm willing to give mascots national championships.
Yes.
Just saying, can't ever take those away. Would the NCAA take a national championship away from a mascot? Probably.
They couldn't.
They wouldn't be able to. But they
exactly. We would stop them.
They would go back and retroactively change the eulogy.
Yeah, exactly. They're just taking a little bone national championship off of his plaque. Just no, gosh, that's the most NCAA behavior I could possibly think of.
No, the legacy will forever stand the test of time. RIP to Q. All right. If you have not, leave us a 5-star review. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch every episode of the Saturday Down South podcast, which is presented by Texas Pete. Follow us on the app formerly known as Twitter, at the SES Pod, at Set Down South, at CJ O'Gara, at Go So Hard. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.